Welcome to If Adoptive Mama Ain't Happy. Today's episode is 21, Season 2, A Christian Perspective on the History of Adoption in the United States. I'm Leah. I'm a licensed professional counselor and parenting coach specializing in adoptive Christian families. I would love to get your feedback on this podcast. You can do that by rating and reviewing the podcast in Apple Podcasts or wherever you access this podcast. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel, which has the same name, If Adoptive Mama Ain't Happy. If you subscribe there, you will always get the video version of this podcast. But again, Apple Podcasts or any of the other podcast programs will get you the opportunity to rate and review. So I'd love it if you would do that. Another thing I would love for y'all to do is to check out my website. It's www.faithful-futures.com. And there you can sign up for my email list. If you're on that list, you will be privy to when the group coaching program that I'm developing right now, when that goes live. It's basically a small group coaching program in order to serve Christian adoptive moms. So it's going to be an extension of this podcast. Some of the things I talk about will be addressed in the small group format. And the reason why it's small group is because not only can I help each person in the group with their individual issues, concerning adoption, you can also support each other. I am not a Christian adoptive mom. I'm a Christian mom, but I don't have any adopted kids. So I have the expertise. I've worked with many adoptive parents and adopted children, but I want you to have the support of other Christian moms that are going through exactly the same thing you are. So that's the idea behind the group coaching program. So again, if you go to the website and you sign up for the email list, you'll be notified when that program goes live. I also have a link there for a Facebook group for Christian adoptive moms. There's also a video devotional for Christian adoptive moms like you. So there's so much there on the website. So once again, that's www.faithful-futures.com. I look forward to seeing you there. So the history of adoption in the U.S. goes hand in hand with Christian values and principles because, as we know, the Bible actually instructs us to care for the orphan. Fortunately, adoption practices have been evolving over the centuries and now focus more on the welfare of the child. So I want to explore this fascinating history of adoption for you and reflect on how things have changed and how your adoption journey resulted from this history. So the early Christian influence on adoption. As we know, the concept of adoption is rooted in the Bible. The New Testament describes believers as adopted into God's family through Jesus Christ. That's Ephesians 1:5. Christian communities viewed adoption as a moral duty, particularly to care for orphans and abandoned children. Now, in colonial America, informal adoption practices were common, and they reflected a community's commitment to living out biblical teachings on caring for the least of these. That's Matthew 25:40. Now let's talk a little bit about the rise of orphanages and formalized adoption. This was in the 19th century. The U.S. saw a rise in the number of orphanages, many of which were founded by Christian organizations. Now, the controversial orphan trains, which operated from 1854 to 1929, were created by Christian charities like the Children's Aid Society to place orphaned or abandoned children from crowded cities into homes across the country. Many of these children came from Irish Catholic families, and I would imagine unwed mothers were often forced to give up their illegitimate children. Though the charities had good intentions, the orphan trains often resulted in children being placed in homes where they were seen more as indentured servants or forced laborers than family members. So the first adoption law in the U.S. was passed in Massachusetts in 1851. The Adoption of Children Act recognized adoption as a legal process, emphasizing the best interests of the child. This law also influenced the Christian ideals of providing a stable and loving home for children. Now, The social gospel movement also affected adoption in the 19th and 20th centuries. So basically, this movement emphasized the application of Christian ethics to social problems. It advocated for the care and protection of children. Many Christian social workers and reformers, influenced by the social gospel, pushed for laws and practices that would ensure the welfare of adopted children, including the establishment of foster care systems and the regulation of adoption agencies. After World War II, there was a significant increase in the number of adoptions in the U.S. This period, often referred to as the baby scoop era, saw many single mothers encouraged to place their children for adoption, often through Christian agencies. The stigma surrounding unwed motherhood was a driving force, and many Christian organizations played a role in facilitating these adoptions. However, this era also faced criticism for coercive practices and a lack of support for birth mothers. During this time, Christian adoption agencies like Bethany Christian Services, which was founded in 1944, became prominent. These organizations sought to place children in homes where they would be raised with Christian values. Now we come to the transracial and international adoption boom of the 1960s to the present. The civil rights movement and changing social attitudes in the 60s and 70s led to an increase in transracial adoptions. In 1972, the National Association of Black Social Workers issued a statement against transracial adoption, arguing that Black children should be raised in Black families. Despite this, many Christian families felt called to adopt children of different races, viewing it as an expression of God's inclusive love. Now, international adoption also grew during this period, particularly after the Korean War. Many Christian families adopted children from Korea, Vietnam, and later from other countries. This was because they were driven by a sense of global Christian responsibility. So organizations like Holt International, founded by evangelical Christians Harry and Bertha Holt in 1956, played a significant role in facilitating these adoptions. Side note, I recently learned that before COVID, most international adopted children came from China. Colombia has now replaced China because the COVID restrictions in China were never changed back when it came to adoption. I also wonder if there were some political reasons that have anything to do with China no longer allowing Americans to adopt from its country. So now let's talk about the modern Christian adoptive movements. In recent decades, there has been a renewed focus within Christian communities on adoption, especially as a response to the global orphan crisis. Movements like the Christian Alliance for Orphans, founded in 2004, advocate for adoption, foster care, and orphan care as tenets of Christianity. The Orphan Sunday Initiative, observed annually, encourages churches worldwide to promote adoption and foster care. Statistics from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services indicate that as of 2020, there were over 117,000 children waiting to be adopted in the U.S. foster care system. Many Christian families continue to respond to this need, motivated by their faith and desire to provide loving homes for these children. So in conclusion, the history of adoption in the U.S. reflects a deep connection to Christian values, from the early informal practices to the modern day emphasis on transracial and international adoption. While the journey has been complex and it's had some controversy, especially with the orphan trains, the underlying motivation has often been a desire to live out the biblical call to care for the orphaned and vulnerable, ensuring that every child has the opportunity to grow up in a loving, stable family. So, as I always do at the end of the podcast, I just want to thank you for answering the call to adopt. Jesus loves you, and so do I.